Okay, I think we'll get started as it is 12:36. I think there may be a few more people coming in. Just start with some, thank you all for coming first. Some housekeeping. If the fire alarm goes off, we should vacate the room. The way to get out of the room is back up the stairs, and then when you get to the area upstairs, go out through the doors on your left onto Market Street. If you need any assistance in doing any of that, let me know. Before we get started, this is an event organised by the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee at Jesus College, and I want to draw your attention to 3 other events that we have coming up next month as part of our recognition of LGBTQ+ History Month. So you will see posters like this around college advertising 3 speaker events. On Tuesday, the 11th of February, we have Raymond Trow, who was a visiting professor here last term, speaking on the ongoing struggles of coming out at work for LGBTQ+ workers. That's from 1 till 2 in the Ship Street Centre. On the following week, Monday the 17th, from 5 to 6, we have Sophie Grace Chappell talking on being a transgender person in a cisgender world. She'll be talking about her book Transfigured. That's 5 to 6, and that will be here in the Digital Hub in the Cheng building. And then the week after that, on Tuesday, 25th of February, we have a doctoral student, Sam Woodward, talking on the body and sexuality in Plato. So this is going to be a talk about how Plato and ancient Athenians of his day thought about homosexuality. But today our topic is the gender pay gap, and I'm delighted to welcome back to Jesus College Jemima Olchawski. Jemima is the CEO of the Fawcett Society. She graduated in PPE from Jesus College in 2005. She also has a master's degree from the LSE. Before becoming CEO at the Fawcett Society, Jemima was previously CEO for Agenda, the Alliance for Women and Girls at Risk, where she led campaigns on supporting survivors of abuse, gendered responses to women's mental health, and connections between violence against women and girls and contact with the criminal justice system. She was also previously head of policy and insight at the Fawcett Society, where she led projects such as Sex and Power, Strategies for Success, and work on gender pay gap reporting. And previously, she's also held roles at the London Borough of Newham and at the Fabian Society. So I will begin our conversation with some questions of my own to get things going, and then after about 20 to 30 minutes, I'll open it up to the floor to questions and comments. So, welcome back to
Thank
Jesus
you.
College, Jemima. Perhaps a first question to start with is just to say a bit more about where you currently work. So, what is the Fawcett Society and what kind of work does it do?
Sure. So we're a membership organisation. We say member-powered organisation, dedicated to ending sexism and misogyny of all kinds for all women and girls in the UK. Been around for over 150 years. Trace our roots back to the suffragist Millicent Fawcett, who laid the first petition for Parliament for women to have the right to vote. At that time, she wasn't actually old enough to sign the petition, and dedicated her entire life to women securing the vote, and died a couple of years after 1928, when all women finally did get that right. So we've got a long history, but obviously the organisation's kind of evolved quite a lot over that time, and we exist really to exert influence from a feminist perspective over policy and legislative processes and our politics. So we do a lot of work around women's economic equality and the workplace, a lot around political representation and women's representation in positions of power, and around norms and stereotypes and how they shape our experiences in the economy, in society, and at home. We do that through kind of research and then campaigning and lobbying. So that's kind of broadly the type of stuff we do. At the moment, we're doing a piece of work on understanding what feminist AI would look like.
Wow. Okay.
We did a piece of work last year which was about what we call public harm, so the ways in which women, in particular black and minoritised women, are harmed by the services that should be keeping us safe, whether that's policing, mental health services, education system. So it's a very broad organisation, and I guess one of the things that's special about Fawcett is that there are these amazing kind of organisations, grassroots and long-standing, that campaign on a particular feminist issue, say period poverty or domestic abuse, or for a particular cohort of women. Say we share office space with the Young Women's Trust, but Fawcett is the only organisation that exists to end sexism in its entirety for all women. So it's got this kind of joining up mission.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, there's lots I could pursue there, not least the idea of feminist AI, which I'm really intrigued by. But we're here to talk about specifically the gender pay gap as one sort of expression of this larger phenomenon of sexism and gender inequality. So what is the gender pay gap?
So, as lots of you here may probably already know, in simple terms, the gender pay gap is a statistic that measures the difference in average hourly earnings between women and men. And in the UK, for all workers, it's just under 14%. So that means on average, for every £1 a man earns, a woman is earning 86 pence. And taking home around £600 a month less on average than men. That's obviously important in and of itself because it means women have got less money in their pocket. But really, the reason I'm particularly interested in the gender pay gap is that it's an indicator of the whole series of ways that women are disadvantaged in our economy and in our society. So it's representative of the fact that women are less likely to progress to the most senior roles, that the jobs that they do are consistently lower paid and undervalued, that their working choices are constrained by more unpaid working commitments. And so you can't really, there's no kind of silver bullet that's going to close the gender pay gap. But if we had a smaller gender pay gap, it would probably be indicative that we'd move closer to addressing some of those issues.
And so digging into, I suppose, beginning to dig into the causes of this gender pay gap, but also maybe trying to understand more fully exactly what it is. So if you're an economist, you'll have a theory that there are things that in general affect how much people get paid. So education, for example, other things being equal, the more education somebody has, the higher their qualifications, then other things being equal, the more likely they are, the higher their pay is likely to be. So is the gender pay gap a reflection of the fact that women have less of the things, fewer of the things that generally determine higher pay? Or is it a reflection of the fact that women get paid less even when they have a certain amount of those things?
Yeah. Well,
that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect sense. It's a mix of all of those.
Right, yeah.
So, education is a really interesting example because women are more likely to have a degree than men.
Right.
Has been the case since the 90s. So the women who first kind of broke that threshold now in their late 50s, very senior in their careers, and yet the pay gap hasn't closed. We did some research that came out in November for Equal Pay Day. So that's the day when kind of effectively women stop getting paid relative to men for the rest of the year because of that average difference, which is the 20th of November on this year. Right. And we broke down the kind of different drivers. And education is actually kind of it's driving the gender pay gap the other way. So it's reducing the gender pay gap by about 6%, because women are much more highly educated than men. But within that, men have a higher return from a degree than women. So having an education will mean you earn more than if you didn't have a university education, but it won't protect you against the pay gap because a man with that same degree will earn more. So the returns to a degree on average to a man across his lifetime are £180,000, but for women it's £100,000. So I tend to think of it as driven by, maybe like divide it into kind of four things. So one is that women tend to be sorted into the lowest paid sectors. So women are much more likely to work in care, which is much lower paid than science, technology, engineering roles, which tend to be much better paid. And so the lowest paid jobs in our society, social care, childcare, these jobs are consistently done much more by women, again, disproportionately by black and minoritised women. We know that women are much less likely to be promoted to the most senior roles, so our research shows that men hold 2/3 of the positions of power in our society, and that is fairly steady. And so obviously those are the most highly paid roles. That's also important because when you need women in positions of decision-making power to enact the changes that will benefit the rest of us more broadly. Women still do the majority of unpaid care work and domestic labour, and so they're much more likely to work part-time or shorter hours. Part-time work is lower paid, even if you're doing a job that is the same as your colleague, but you're doing it 30 hours a week rather than 35. On average, women then will get paid less for that per hour. And also there are fewer opportunities then for women to progress because they need more flexibility if they've got to do pickups or visiting elderly relatives. And there's fewer high paid jobs that women can move into that will enable them to accommodate that flexibility. So one of the big things that happens is that it's not by no means the only cause of the pay gap, but motherhood is one of the biggest single influences. And after that, women's pay about 30% of the gap opens up over the following 12 years. And it's in part because of reduced working hours, but actually then a scarring effect where they remain their wages remain kind of suppressed by those responsibilities and they don't catch up. And then the final part is the bit that's kind of harder to measure. So when we did that analysis and we put in all these different things that might explain the pay gap, so level of education, demographic features that contribute, length of time in your job, whether you work in the public sector or the private sector, all of this. And we divvied out the different chunks that explain it, but 63% couldn't be explained by anything in that model. So all of the factors that we would expect to be contributing. And that points to a large chunk of the gap coming from just simple discrimination. Right. So we can't say it's all of it because we don't know what it is, but it's likely that a significant part of that is discrimination. And so that gets to this question of equal pay, which is different to the gender pay gap. The legal right to be paid the same for work of equal value or the same work. And that is illegal, but we know it does still happen and is likely to be a big part of what is suppressing women's pay.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I hadn't appreciated how far straightforward discrimination could be a role in explaining this gap. So maybe we come back to that when we think about the possible responses to the gap. But before we do that, are there differences in the gender pay gap across different categories of women? So does this differ across race or ethnicity or across education levels, for example?
So there's really significant differences by ethnicity. So black African women have one of the highest pay gap's around 26% less than all other men. Also similarly high for Pakistani and Bangladeshi women. The motherhood pay penalty those groups experience is also larger again than the penalties experienced by white women. And that's a consequence of kind of the overlapping, intersecting inequalities of racism and sexism. Yeah, class is interesting, but I guess the best way we've got to look at that is by occupation.
Yeah.
The gap is larger for higher paid women. Okay. And proportionately smaller for lower paid women. That, I think, in large part comes from the minimum wage. So that creates this floor and this baseline that lifts women up and is an important part of closing the gap. But of course, a relatively small gap when you're on a very low income is very, very important in terms of your real life income. So that introduction of the minimum wage and women's increasing education levels have been the real drivers of the closure of the pay gap over the last kind of couple of decades. There's, again, a much higher gap for disabled women. The stats are kind of less current on that. And there is a challenge with all of these things where we use ONS data to calculate the gender pay gap, and that's produced every year. But data isn't collected on sufficient scale to regularly do that by ethnicity. So you have to, for us to look at it, we have to kind of wait for multiple cohorts and look at it over multiple years so that you have big enough samples. But I would say that it's incumbent on government and others to actually make the effort to recruit and oversample so that you can look at that issue, because it's clearly very significant and you're not going to close the pay gap. It might be kind of closing overall, but for groups within that, it isn't closing, then we're not going to achieve it.
Okay. And why does the gender pay gap matter? So, you know, somebody might say, well, there are all kinds of inequalities in the world and some of them are properly of concern and others aren't. So why is this inequality something we should be concerned to address?
Well, I'd say in pure terms, it sort of represents this stymieing of women's potential. So women could have more choice over how they work, which is obviously a very important part of our lives, but they're constrained by these kind of various factors that we've talked about. They could have more economic power, because obviously having more money is very important for your kind of choices, but also your quality of life. So we did a survey a couple of years ago. We said to women, you know, you're about £600 a month worse off than men on average. What would you spend that money on if you had it? And the top answer was essentials like turning on the heating and the lights more. Right. And number two was things for my children. So women are experiencing additional hardship, real poverty, because they don't have this resource. But right across the piece, it's women's choices and freedom to kind of live their life being restricted. But also it matters for our economy, because we've got these very, highly educated women, or women who are kind of in the wrong place because they're underused, their skills are underexploited because they're stuck in jobs that enable them to kind of meet these responsibilities, or where it's sort of perceived they should be by society. And then we don't get their talents and their input into other areas where they would be more productive, more efficient. So there's a big kind of social challenge there. Yeah. And the consequences are lifelong. Women retire on smaller pension pots. They're more likely to live in poverty. It makes them more economically dependent on their partners, which is important, where women, might be experiencing domestic abuse, or might just not want to be with their partner anymore, but are restricted because of that lower income. Yeah.
So there's a kind of unfairness there, or a symptom of unfairness in itself, and there are then a set of consequences coming out of it, both for kind of economic efficiency and maybe further consequences in terms of social justice, like if women are more financially dependent on their partners, then that creates a power relationship which is potentially problematic. One of your responses a moment ago prompted me to think of another question, which is, how has the pay gap changed over time. Do we know about that? So it's currently 14%. Where does that sort of stand historically? Is it narrowed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's decreased about 10 percentage points since 1997. Great. But it hasn't been evenly across the board. So for a long time it stayed quite static amongst the youngest women. Obviously we've got those different kind of dynamics within that by ethnicity and so on. But as I say, it has primarily been by these kind of policy tools that I'm not sure how much more benefit there is to be gained from them. So that minimum wage floor, increases in women's education, we're not going to see the same increase again in women's levels of education. And even if we did, within that cohort, women are still earning less than their male peers. So if we really want to close it, we are going to have to sort of do some things that are quite different in the way we structure our economy and our society. I think we sort of need to get a bit bolder. And Rachel Reeves has made a commitment. She wants to be the first chancellor to close the pay gap, which
is like ambitious.
Also it's like a huge campaign win for the Fawcett Society, like 100 years.
Yeah.
And we've got a verbal commitment. But, you know, the government is going to need more than that ambition if they want that to happen, because it's just kind of a wish, right?
Yeah.
And they're going to need to be willing to be a bit bolder about changing some of the status quo in how we kind of work and how we recognise value.
Yeah. So that gets us onto the question, what can and should be done about it?
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm asking that as a general question, and then sort of maybe sort of nested within that, I guess I'm interested in how far this is something that where the employer is the sort of agent that we're looking to do something different. Or you know, your comments a moment ago, you were pointing to the way this is sort of rooted in background ways that we organise work in society, care work, for example. So would it be so what is in particular the role of employers in addressing this problem?
I think, it's a really interesting question. So employers have a huge role to play. There's huge diversity of performance on this issue amongst employers, which shows that there is a lot of leeway, kind of levers at their disposal to improve the situation. So a lot of the things that Fawcett will campaign on are about changing workplaces, and we would always encourage employers to do those steps voluntarily. But ultimately, if you really want to kind of drive that change, you have to require employers to do it, because you'll get like some ambitious ones who want to do it, and then you'll get the laggards that don't bother. So we've got gender pay gap reporting now. There's a debate about its impact, which is like totally legitimate. It's obligatory, and sort of almost all employers do it. You know, it's like 10,000 employers report. Before that, it was voluntary. I think there was something like 12 employers reported. So the previous government committed to a voluntary ethnicity pay gap reporting scheme. Like, lovely, but if you actually want to kind of get the information that you need, you're going to need to require everyone to do it. And also good employers want that, because obviously it creates a kind of an even playing field. So there's a lot about our working practices, and employers can change that, whether that's being really transparent about flexibility, not discriminating against women when they have a baby. Just don't, if you, like 54,000 women every year have to leave their job early as a result of getting pregnant or having a baby. They're forced out, they're made redundant, they're sacked, they just feel like it's too awkward and they have to go. We just, you know, if employers could stop doing that, that would be great. Yeah. But beyond that are factors which are not within employers' control. So that's the sort of unpaid care is one of the biggest ones that creates this kind of, that we go into the workforce with such different kind of contexts. And I think really government has to play an important part in driving that change. So one of the simplest things would be to reform shared parental leave, so that men are actually incentivised and supported to take time out and care for their children, which is another thing about the pay gap, is that it changes the incentives. It makes it more expensive in opposite sex households for men to take unpaid time out. So it's sort of reinforcing. But if you had a system where that was normalised and encouraged, that would lessen the impact for women in the workplace, because men would be the same risk that they might take time off. And it changes habits long term, so that men do more of the kind of domestic work in a household, which is sort of liberating for women long term. And, you know, probably good for those men as well, that they get to have that kind of quality relationship with their children and engage in that sphere. And then to really get to the root of that, we have a very pernicious and powerful kind of system of reinforcing the gender norms that play into that. And I think we're quite a long way from recognising the power of those and understanding how we pick it apart. And in fact, you know, it's an area where lots of people positively feel it's a good thing to replicate them. So, you know, when they're raising their children, they will want to teach them what it's like to be a good boy and what boys should do and what girls should do, rather than, you know, sort of trying to dismantle those differences. And so by the age of 6, children are more likely to associate kindness with girls and intelligence with boys. We've already created a set of ideas and expectations about how you should be and what is valuable, and that feeds into what gets valued, who gets kind of identified as having a particular set of skills, and the roles that we feel we can and we should do. But it's quite difficult to unpick that and to begin to think about how we would reshape social attitudes. But I mean, there are things that I think we could be trying to do.
Yeah. Is there a connection also with policies towards social care? I mean, you mentioned that women disproportionately work in the care sector, and that's sort of the sector in which there's a problem of low pay. But I'm also thinking of, as well as sort of parental care, there's care for people with disabilities, care for relatives with who are elderly or have illnesses that come with old age. And because of that background norm about who does the care work, it seems like women are much more vulnerable to doing that work when there's a gap in public provision. Yeah. So if we were to have better public provision for care work across the board, then that might address the gender pay gap in 2 ways, both by paying the workers in that sector better, and also by taking some of that vulnerability away from women who are otherwise the kind of default caregiver.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess a part of what that is doing is sort of lightening that disproportionate burden of women being more likely to do that unpaid care work. And at the moment we have a system that kind of, well, it invisibilises the cost because it sort of puts it on individual households, and it disproportionately is women that does it. So if we properly invested in that, it would have a huge impact. And over the last few years, we've seen the biggest increases in women leaving the workforce in their 50s. And that's associated with issues around health, but also around growing numbers leaving because of caring responsibilities. And that's probably not towards their own children, but older relatives, maybe grandchildren, and those kind of responsibilities. So if we don't invest in that, we are going to kind of continue to lose these people from the workforce and the kind of associated productivity. But yeah, at the same time, you need to, it makes it very expensive because these are very expensive systems, and the people in them are very underpaid. If we actually sort of invested what was needed and paid those people what they deserved, it would be quite a radical transformation, especially given that this is a growing portion of kind of public expenditure, which isn't to say I don't think we should do it, but is to sort of say that if we really want to get to the root of this, we do need to kind of be quite ambitious and think quite differently. And maybe get some more men to do it. I mean, that's the other thing. When men move into roles traditionally dominated by women, the average pay does increase, and vice versa. When women go into the men's jobs, the average pay declines. So if we can get some more men in, and we can, you know...
Yes.
Get that respect.
Yes, I can relate to that. And do unions have a role here? In
Yeah.
Trade unions.
So, I mean, they've got a bit of a checkered past.
Right.
So overall, unions, the evidence is clear that they sort of lead to better paying conditions. And at the moment, we've seen some big equal pay cases going through, like Next, Asda. And the reason that these are kind of retail or Birmingham and local government is because these are unionised workforces. So you can't, it's incredibly difficult to bring an equal pay claim as an individual. You need to find out that you're not being paid equally. You need to go through this arduous process of conflict resolution and grievance internally. Then you need to go to an employment tribunal. It can go on for years and years and years. It's horrific. You're torn to shreds. You may or may not get anything at the end. But if you're in a union, then there's a sort of the group strength, and that union can kind of support and coordinate, bring people together. I mean, these kind of class actions, which is why the cases that we see are these really kind of big and long-term ones. Yeah. But in the past, they have colluded with employers to keep quiet about the pay gap. So in Birmingham, the unions knew that the women, dinner ladies, were being paid less than the bin men, but they didn't want to have to lower the men's wages in order to address that. And so there was sort of, the women were told, basically, we'll negotiate this for you on your behalf, but their needs weren't actually properly represented. I think, broadly, I think that's shifted now, and the trade unions are really actively addressing it. And the majority of trade union members are women now. They have been more led by men, but that is shifting as well. So we've got more women in those leadership roles. Yeah.
So what do you think are the kind of immediate political prospects for doing some of the things that you've listed as necessary to address the pay gap?
I think broadly we're in a much more positive place with the current government than we were. So the government's committed to this huge expansion of childcare provision, which is brilliant and very important. People in the sector are very stressed out about it because it's not properly funded, so it will put further pressures on those settings, and it probably isn't going to address those issues around low pay and progression opportunities for women in the sector. But increasing that provision will be an important part of addressing that sort of the challenge around balancing care. They've talked about reviewing shared parental leave, but not yet actually started reviewing it. So I'd like a little bit more speed on that. And there is a broad sense that it would be a good thing to address these. There's a different kind of language around equality now than there was at the end of the last government, where Kemi Badenoch, as Minister for Women and Equalities, or Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, sort of released this report decrying all equality, diversity and inclusion as sort of unevidenced waste of time and money. So there's a different attitude. Also, there's a different, I would say, there's a kind of a challenge for campaigners, because for the last, there's lots of challenges for campaigners, but since kind of 2010, the politics has been, more kind of free market inclined. And so the solutions developed have been quite nudgy and kind of quite, and there's been a focus on employers. So gender pay gap reporting is really good, and Fawcett campaigned for it, and I think it's an important step. But there was sort of a sense that if you put this in place and the information's there, this will solve the problem. But obviously it hasn't. You could encourage employers to voluntarily take steps like not ask about employment history, pay history, so that reduces pay gaps, but a real resistance to anything that was sort of bigger and more structural. Whereas I think the political hinterland of the government now is more open to those kind of, to the possibility and the value of those more structural interventions. Whether the politics will sort of mean that they actually deliver on those is a different question.
Great. Okay. Thank you. I have some further thoughts, but